our controls now. Now let's enable this form to be submitted. I will use the normal approach you might know from a normal Angular 2 web app. I will first get a local reference to the form Angular 2 created for me, and I can do this by placing this local reference, I'm naming it F, on the form attribute, or excuse me, on the form element, and like this it would only give me access to the form HTML element. I want to get access to the form Angular 2 created for me in JavaScript, and I tell Angular 2 that I want to have access to this by assigning the ngForm value to this local reference. This is the little trick we learn in the normal Angular 2 course, which gives us access to the form Angular 2 created. Well, with this I can place the ngSubmit directive, which only has this event here therefore on it, to listen to the submission of this form, and then simply execute some method, let's name it onAddItem for example, and pass the form to this method. Well, and with all this setup in place, I can now go to the body of this TypeScript file, to this component, remove all the boilerplate again, which I don't need as of now, and simply implement the onAddItem method, where I know that I will receive a form. So I will get a form as an argument, because I'm passing it up here to the onAddItem method, and this will be of type ngForm, of course. And with this form I'm getting here, well, I can simply log it to the console to see what we actually did get. So let me now save this and go back to the running application to view this in action. And now if I enter, well, let's enter milk, but 10 items of it, and click on add item, you see here is the form we got. And there you see we got our controls, which is a form group, and we also got a value for the overall ngForm element, which has the amount and ingredient name properties, since these are the two controls we registered. So with this, we're submitting the form. Now let's also add some validation to it in the next lecture. In a normal Angular 2 web app, you can of course also validate forms in an Ionic 2 app. You can of course use the very same validation logic and concept you used from your Angular 2 web app. So here's the challenge for you. Try implementing a very basic validation here on your own. Try ensuring that both input fields here have to be non-empty, so they are both required, and that you disable the add item button if at least one of the two fields is actually empty, so is not valid. I'll show you my approach of doing this in a couple of seconds, so now is your chance to pause the video. Were you successful? Let's now implement this together, and let's make sure that we actually ensure these fields here to not be empty, because right now I can submit the form even if nothing is entered in the amount field. Keep in mind this placeholder is not an actual value, it's just an example, it's not actually filled into the input field. So to add this validation, I'll go back to the template here, and I'll add another attribute here to my IONInput, the required attribute. This is the normal HTML5 required validation attribute, which tells HTML and therefore Angular 2 that I need this input field to be non-empty, that there has to be some value in it. I'll also do the same for the amount input here. With this, Angular 2 will start its default validation logic and place the ngInvalid and so on classes on this input if it is invalid, and it also stores the validity of the controls and the overall form. I can use this on the button to add property binding here and bind the disabled property. And I want to disable the button if the form is not valid, so I can simply check if not form valid. Form valid is true if the form is valid, so if this is not the case, I want to disable the button, which I'm doing here. Well, and with this tiny change in place, if I go back and let the app reload, you see the button is now disabled. It is still disabled if I enter something here, but if I enter something here too, and now both fields are populated, I can again submit the form. So now we got validation in place, again, just like it works in a normal Angular 2 app, but now in our Ionic 2 app. We created this live and we added this template-driven approach, or we used the template-driven approach to add controls and to submit the form and to also validate it. This is all great, and with that we can already now work on actually storing the items we're creating here when adding, or when hitting the add item button, I should say. We need a service for this because we want to store this state. We want to store this array of items in some place which is persistent and which allows us to access it from different parts of our app. Because remember, later we will also be able to add items to our shopping list from a recipe when we add the ingredients of that recipe to the list. Therefore, I will create a new folder in the source folder, the services folder. This should hold my shopping list service. Now, if you're feeling bold, definitely go ahead and try creating this shopping list service on your own. It's not that complicated. It will in the end only store an array of ingredients. You might also think about creating a model for these ingredients, so a separate interface or ingredient class, which you can then use to have a clear type definition. I will do this too in a second. So you might create this model, you might create this shopping list with this array of ingredients, and then you can also think about adding some methods for adding a single item, adding multiple items, removing an item, and getting all the items, getting the array. Maybe make sure that we get a copy of that array and not the full array, not the reference to the array. A lot of things, let's go there step by step, and again, challenge for you, try it on your own. Now I want to start with actually creating the model I'm going to use. And with model, I simply mean a TypeScript class which defines how an ingredient should look like throughout this course or throughout this app here. So I will create such a model by simply creating a new folder in the source folder here. I'll name it models. And in this models file here, I will simply create a new file named ingredient because it should define how an ingredient looks like. Ingredient.typescript. You could also name it ingredient.model.typescript if you prefer this. Now in this file, I'll simply export a new class named ingredient. And here I will quickly define how such an ingredient looks like. Now we could do this in the long form by setting up the properties here, then creating a constructor and assigning values in the body of this constructor, or use the TypeScript shortcut to do this all in one step by adding a constructor like this. And in the constructor argument list, I know that an ingredient has a name and amount. Name will be a string and amount will be a number. So these are the arguments this constructor will get when a new ingredient is created. And I want to store those arguments in properties of this newly instantiated class. And the TypeScript shortcut to achieve this is to simply add an accessor in front of this argument. Now I want to make them publicly available, so I will simply add public in front of name and public in front of amount. And again, what this will do is it will automatically create properties with this name and assign the values you pass with this constructor here to those properties. And this is all. This defines how an ingredient should look like. It should have a name, which is a string, and amount, which is a number. And with that, we can reuse this class to create new ingredients and to define types of arrays and so on we're going to use to make sure that we're using the same, type of ingredient throughout the app. In the next lecture, I will continue with creating the actual shopping service. The ingredient class created in the last lecture, it's now time to work on the service. So let's add a new file to the services folder, the shoppinglist.ts file. And again, you could name this shoppinglist.service.ts. Now in this service file here, I will export a class named shoppinglistService like this to describe what it is. And now here's your challenge. Try populating or filling this shopping list service with life on your own. Again, we will need some property which stores an array of our ingredients, and then we need methods to add a new item to that array, add multiple items at once, remove an item, or get a copy of that array of shopping list ingredients. Now, this is your task. Good luck with that. And if you're stuck at some place, try to finish all you feel able to finish, and then we will solve this together in a couple of seconds. Time to pause the video now. So, were you successful? Let's start with the property. I'm going to make this a private property so that it's not accessible from outside, and I'm just naming it ingredients. This will hold all the ingredients, so I will use my own ingredient class and therefore import it from the models folder up here to assign the type, or to tell TypeScript which types of items will be stored in this ingredients property. So an array of ingredients, this is how I define this type, and it's an empty array at the beginning because we're starting with an empty shopping list. Now, in order to make sure that it doesn't stay empty, we need to be able to add an item. Now, such an item could either be a finished ingredient, like this, you could say we're getting an ingredient, or you expect to get a name and the amount, and then you create that ingredient on the fly. I'm going to go with the latter approach. Both approaches are fine though. So with this name and amount passed as arguments here, I can go to my ingredients array up here and push a new item on this array. So I will create a new ingredient here on the fly using my constructor, this TypeScript class I just created a few seconds ago in the last lecture. And there, to the constructor, we need to pass a name and amount. How convenient that we just got this as parameters here in this method. This allows us to add a single item, but sometimes, especially when adding a whole recipe, a list of ingredients, we need to be able to add multiple items at once. So here I'll add the add items method, and here I expect to get a list of items. So items, and this shall be an array of ingredients. So not a list of names and amounts, but just a finished list of ingredients. Since we get this list of ingredients, the question is, how do we actually add this to our ingredients array here? Now, unfortunately, we can't say this ingredients push and then push an array. That would push the array to this array, but that means it simply creates one new element on our ingredients array, which is this pushed array, which is this array. So it is not splitting up the array into its individual items and passing it to our old array. Instead, it will push this array as one single item, which is not what we want. To split up this array into the individual items, we can use a ES6 feature supported by TypeScript, the spread operator, which is this operator, the three dots. This in front of items means deconstruct this array into its individual elements so that we have a list of elements instead of an array of elements. And then we can indeed use push to push all those individual elements to our existing array. So this will now work as expected. So with that, we got methods to add items to the array. Now we also want to be able to get this array, get a copy. So I will add a get items method, and you could of course also name those methods add ingredients, get ingredients, whatever you like. Well, and get items should in the end return this ingredients array, but I don't want to return it like this, because this will return a reference to this array. And you could do this, there's not necessarily something wrong about this, but I also want to show an alternative. If you want to show a copy, which means if you added this copy thereafter, it won't edit the original array stored here, you can simply use slice without any arguments. And this will create a real copy of this array and return this copy instead of the actual array, which will kind of also defeat the purpose of making it private, right? Because if you return a full reference to the original array, you're able to edit it from outside thereafter. Well, and then finally, I'll add a remove item method, which allows me to pass an index of the item I want to delete, and then I can simply access my ingredients array and call the splice method for this passed index and splice exactly one element, which of course removes this single element. With this, the shopping list service is finished. We're now able to add items, to get items, and to remove an item. Let's now start hooking this up when we submit our form here in the shopping list file, in the shopping list page, so that we actually add this item to this array before we then add some logic to display it on this page too. We created our shopping list service. Let's now make sure that we actually add this created item when we submit the form to this service. Now you have all the knowledge you need to do this on your own, so another challenge for you. Go to your shopping list page component here and make sure that in onAddItem you somehow get access to the shopping list service and that you add an item to this array, of ingredients stored in this service. You will kind of need to inject the service for that and also think about on which level you're going to provide the service. Now is the time to pause the video. Let's do this together in a couple of seconds. So, were you successful? Let's start by providing the service. We do this in the app module here in the providers array. You could provide it on component level, but we're actually going to access this shopping list service from another place in the app too. So I will provide it on an application level to make sure that the same instance of this service is used throughout the whole app, because of course it's important that this array of ingredients stored in the service only exists once. So here I will simply provide the shopping list service, and therefore also add the import here at the top, pointing to the shopping list service file in the services folder. And with this added to app module, I can now go to the shopping list TypeScript file here on add item. And here I want to access the service, so I will need to inject it via the constructor. I'll bind it to a property named SL service. Of course, you could choose any other name. And I'll name it and I'll use the type shopping list service, which of course also needs to be imported from the shopping list file in the services folder. Now with this, I make the service available in this component, and in on add item, I can therefore then call shopping list service add item. We added this method in the last lecture, and here I simply want to use the form I get submitted here, access the value of this form, and I know that the name of this ingredient will be stored in a controlled named ingredient name, right? So I will use this name. This property will exist on this value object, and the same is true for the amount. These are the two controls I registered. With this, I'm passing the values from my form to the service, and in the service I will create a new ingredient and add it to the array of ingredients. Well, and with this, I then want to reset the form. So I can call form reset like this to empty the input fields and reset the validation state of the form. This is now all I need to do to create a new item on the form. We will be able to do this, however, we won't be able to see this. Let's at least add a console log to the shopping list here in the add items method, where I console log this ingredient so that we can see if it worked. And with that, if we save it, let's go back to our running application and let's add a new item, for example, bread, 10 items, add. And you see indeed a new ingredient was added. Let's add another one to check if this also works. Now we got 2 ingredients. So our array is getting populated correctly. That looks great. The next step is to actually display those items below the input here, so on the shopping list page here. We'll start working on this in the next lecture.